This is part 2 of your lecture for week 12, day 1, chapter 19. This should be April 28th. So we just got done looking at the Tchaikovsky symphonic overture, symphonic poem, tone poem of Romeo and Juliet. So now let's take a closer look at something that's going to be classified truly as a nationalistic piece, or a piece that's using a lot of nationalism. So again, in this romantic time period, especially the second half of the romantic time period, there's a lot of struggle for national independence going on. There's a lot of wars going on. You've got the Greeks versus the Turks, the Poles fighting the Russians, the Czech trying to not become a part of Austria. Norway broke away from Sweden in this time. So there's a lot of nationalistic feelings that are associated with all these political uprisings that are going on. People all over Europe are becoming more aware of their distinctive heritage. And they want to incorporate that into their national folk music. They want to put that in their concert pieces, in their songs, in their operas. Whether it's symphonic poems or operas, we see the stories or the programs having nationalistic themes. We see the librettos of operas having nationalistic or folk legend plots. We see that this is happening in America as well. We are getting some nationalistic composers trying to help us form our identity as a younger country. Gottschalk, the African American composers are starting to become more known, and the prevalence there. Strong emotions are often stirred up when you're talking about nationalistic pieces. They're often a very effective ambassador. Nationalistic composers deliberately start to break away from forms, harmonic forms, and the traditional forms that we're seeing. Part of it, I think, is a spirit of defiance as they're trying to put their own national identity on the map. And part of it is, with this national identity, they're trying to develop some new musical styles that are particular to them. We have also talked about exoticism being a parallel trend with that nationalism. Audiences are enjoying hearing folk music of other nations besides their own, in the opera, in symphonic poems, in dances. A lot of French composers are writing in a Spanish type of flavor, whether it be rhythm or scales or plots. The Russians tend to write in Italian forms. We've got Czechs trying to imitate the American style that's coming. A good example of this is Dvorak, who wrote the New World Symphony. So he wrote a symphony describing the different movements of our country, how it looks. Bizet's Carmen, an opera set in Spain. So we would not call these nationalistic. Yes, they have nationalistic tendencies of the country they're being written about, but the composer who wrote them is not of that origin. So that's how the difference between calling a piece nationalistic or calling a piece exotic. The nationalism trend is seen, I think, one of the strongest trends is in Russia. Your book calls this group the Russian Kuka. It's often just called the Russian Five. It was an important nationalistic school of composition. They had highly distinctive music. They laid the groundwork, I think, for nationalistic style to come going into that 20th century. It was 5 young men that made up this Russian Five: Balakirev, Sui, Bordin, Rimsky-Korsakov, and Mussorgsky. It's not important that you memorize their names. They came from all different professions. We had an engineer, a chemist, a Navy man, an officer in the Imperial Guard, but they all were amateur composers, amateur musicians, and they were committed to collecting folk songs. And they were trying to self-improve as composers. They met as a group. The one that we're going to take a particular look at today is Mussorgsky. He lived from 1839 to 1881. He was the son of a well-to-do landowner, and social class that he was born into dictated that he would be an officer in the Russian Imperial Guard. So he was a personal officer to the Tsar. He got tired of clerical work and started to experiment with composition. And one of his most well-known compositions is Pictures at an Exhibition, which is from 1874. It was originally written for piano. It's a multi-movement work. And the title is commemorating the painter and architect Victor Hartmann. So each of these it's It reminds me of Schumann's Carnival that we looked at, where each movement was describing a character at a ball. In this piece, at Pictures of an Exhibition, each movement is describing a scene in Russian life, or a scene from the paintings or the work of Victor Hartmann. 50 years later, it was orchestrated by Ravel, and that is the most common way that we hear it now, is as an orchestration, and that's how we're going to listen to it today. So you have in your text on page 284, there are 4 movements that your text talks about. I've put 3 of these on canvas for you to listen to. And so what I'd like you to think about as you're listening to them, and your book gives you wonderful descriptions on them, is think about if you were strolling around in a gallery, and this is the picture that you were looking at. What is the music implying? What do you think the music is trying to get you to see? The first picture, or the first movement, is called Promenade, and it's based on a pentatonic scale. So you're going to hear that, a little bit of an oriental flavor there. I also think that relates to bells. A lot of times bells can be tuned in a pentatonic scale, church bells, and I think that might be the flavor that we're trying to hear then too. So this theme in the Promenade is a Russian folk song, so there's your nationalistic element to it. It has an unusual meter in the fact that it changes between an odd and an even, between 5/4 and a 6/4. That's trying to portray a walking movement, or a walking and stopping and going back and taking a second look at a painting that has attracted your attention. So it's more of a flexible meter. So this is going against that romantic tendency or the Western preference for regular beats. There's a little bit of a call and response between the trumpet and the brass players. All of those are very typical Russian features. So there's your Russian folk song that is the theme. Call and response with the brass. Notice on 284, you have a line of this. See if you can feel that alternating beat between an even measure and an uneven measure as it switches from that 5/4 to 6/4. You'll notice that that movement is very short. It's only a little over 1.5 minutes, but it comes back in between some of the other movements. It links the piece together. The second movement that your book talks about is Nomus, or the Gnomes. And something interesting that you can try to do too, I've given you orchestral views of this, of the orchestra playing. But if you go on YouTube, there are a lot of recordings of this that are actually showing you some Russian artwork that they think depict the story. And that's a nice way to put that program with this piece as well. So Gnomes is drawing on Russian folk art of nutcrackers, those wooden dolls. Nutcrackers tended to be more of a grotesque figure. They weren't dainty, they weren't pretty. And so that's why you hear more of a clumsy or lurching rhythm in this. You also hear a lot of dissonant harmonies, again, trying to give you that idea of perhaps a wooden figure that's walking at an uneven pace. So there's your main theme. You can hear it's minor, you can hear it's dissonant, it has some syncopation to it, it has some uneven rhythms in it. Again, trying to portray to you those wooden dolls, those wooden nutcrackers, those gnomes. The Promenade is inserted in between again, trying to link that all together. It's a little bit more quiet, maybe a little bit more spectator looking or missing or looking back on it. Probably the most famous movement of this is the Great Gate at Kiev. It's the last and the longest number in this Pictures of the exhibition. It's definitely the climax. And it's a fantasy based on architecture. You hear solemn procession, you hear cymbals, you hear bells, you almost hear what would be chanting priests in there. It's nationalistic in the fact that there are 2 Russian melodies that appear in here, as well as that promenade melody that comes back. And again, if you take a look on 285, you've got a nice description of this. So there you recognize that promenade theme again. As you get further into the piece, you get some depiction of some of the quieter themes. And it ends with a very majestic ending with lots of brass. So a really great piece to listen to. I encourage you to go through Canvas and listen to it. I encourage you to go through your text, but I also encourage you to take some time and search it yourself on YouTube and see if you can come up with some of the recordings where they play this or perhaps a movement we didn't listen to, depicting some of the artwork that they think it's depicting of, especially out of the Russian School of Art. So you've got people that are going in a nationalistic fashion. You've got people writing in a realism fashion. You've got people writing in an exotic fashion. All of these are taking the Romantic ideas and they're growing on them and they're expounding them and they're starting to change things. But what about those composers that are very nostalgic for the what was? The Romantic composers of the first part of the Romantic era that they really admired the work of Chopin and Schumann and Schubert. We do have this. There is a movement of neoclassicism that is looking backwards or being a bit nostalgic. They are looking at those composers that use those very predictable forms, that use those symmetrical forms. One of the people that we're going to look at today is probably the most well-known, and that is Johannes Brahms. Brahms lived from 1833 to 1897. He was a close friend of Schumann that we looked at a lot of his miniature works back at the beginning of the Romantic period. Little bit of a trivia for you here. After Schumann, who had a lot of mental problems, as we talked about, died, Brahms took up with Schumann's wife Clara, and they were quite the music power couple. So Brahms turned back to classicism. He thought that the Romantic music was getting too emotional, that things were getting too big, too distorted. He wanted to go back to those stricter forms, those predictable forms, consonant harmonies, the virtuoso being more important. So with Brahms, he wrote a ton of music, a lot of orchestral music. He was an avid student of music history, looking back at what had worked before. He studied counterpoint. He brought in more polyphony than what we had even seen before. And he had put an enormous effort into writing his symphonies. Lots of chamber music. He was a great pianist himself. And Beethoven was another model that he liked to base his works on. The work that you have in your text on page 289 is his Violin Concerto in D. And this Violin Concerto was written for a close friend of his, a 19th century virtuoso, Joseph Joachim, and he accepted advice from the violinist too on how he could show the violin off most and what techniques worked well. It is a wonderful piece on 289. We do not have the first movement in our book, so I only put movement 3 on canvas. But again, for extra listening, I encourage you to look up the first movement of this Violin Concerto Opus 77 because it is in your typical double exposition form. So it's really paying honor to what Mozart did. You hear the exposition played by the orchestra, and then the violinist comes in and plays that exposition again. It follows your typical 3 movements. As I said, on your canvas page and in your text on 289, you have the third movement, which is a rondo. That's typical, isn't it? That's what we talked about with Mozart and Beethoven, with those third movements being rondo. Remember that a rondo form meant that you had an A theme that kept coming back. So we said ABACA was the shortest of those forms that you could have. This form of this rondo happens to be ABACBA, so it's got an extra A in there. It uses a lot of virtuoso technique for the violinist. You're going to hear the violinist playing 2 notes at once, which is called double stops, very difficult to do. This theme sometimes splits between the solo and then the orchestra answering it. There's lots of accents in the meter, giving lots of variety and lots of surprise to the meter. The second theme, the solo line, is ascending. He counters that with the bass lines of the orchestra descending. So there's great contrast between these themes. You'll also notice that there's 2 short cadenzas. We saw a lot of cadenzas in our classical concertos. They're still here in our romantic concertos, and this time he even gives 2 of them. So predictable fast tempo for that third movement. You can hear the double stops there. So that's your A theme. So if you're following along on 290 of your text, you're going to notice that we're coming up to the B theme. And here's your B theme. See if you can hear where it's going to go back to that A theme. Still that B theme. You can hear it getting ready to transition, and there it is. So with your text on 290, see if you can complete listening to this movement and trace your way through that ABA-CBA form. Another composer that had a lot of nostalgia to his work was Mahler. So Mahler had a lot of romantic nostalgia to his work. It wasn't so much that he was caught up in keeping the same forms and keeping the same structure. He liked the excess that the romantic traditions embodied. He embraced that. Whereas Brahms struck back a little bit. We saw traits of Mozart in there with his form. Mahler's almost going the other way. He's taking the romantic movement, instead of moving into nationalistic and exotic tendencies, he's continuing to grow that romantic music. He has huge proportions to his work. He's a great fan of program symphonies. He starts to put choruses in his symphonies. He starts to put soloists in his symphonies. So he's expanding his instrumental works. He deliberately, I think, puts exaggerations in his work that make us a little bit uneasy. Whether this was self-consciousness or not, I don't know. He loved to distort melodies, distort harmonies, distort motives. Sometimes he would do a parody of a melody. Parody means he's taking a melody, but instead of putting it in a straightforward way where it's very recognizable, it's changed somewhat. Maybe the rhythm is made less appealing. Maybe the rhythm is changed so it's not even. Maybe the tonality is changed to minor. He does this with the symphony that we have in your book, the last piece here that is in chapter 18 that we're, excuse me, chapter 19 that we're looking at. And that's his symphony number 1. And in particular, we're looking at the third movement, which is outlined for you on page 295. But he uses Frère Jacques, Frère Jacques, Frère Jacques, a melody that everybody knows. And he uses it throughout this symphony. But in this third movement in particular, it's very slow. It's very distorted, almost giving you the impression of it being part of a funeral march. And so it's hard to listen to it. Mahler was born in Bohemia. He lived near military barracks, so all this political unrest and upheaval very much influenced his growing up. He studied at a Viennese conservatory, which I think has probably a lot to do with why he is looking at continuing these romantic tendencies. He was a very well-known conductor in his time. He had a great career conducting. He had uncompromising standards. He was Jewish. He eventually conducted the Vienna Philharmonic and then has made his way to New York and directed the Philharmonic there. Not a great, huge output of pieces that he wrote, 10 symphonies, 6 song cycles, but all of his pieces are very long and very involved. So this symphony, the number 1 that's in your text, it started out as a 1-movement symphonic poem. Then it grew to that grandiose extreme of 5 movements, and eventually he whittled it down and revised it into a standard 4-movement symphony. But there are fragments of many common songs in here that I want you to see if you can recognize. There's a lot of counterpoint, so again, there's some polyphony in there. There's a lot of changing combinations of instruments giving you some different sounds. With this funeral march, there's a trio in it, which uses an earlier song about lost love. It has a minuet and trio form, so typical for what we'd expect that third movement of a symphony to do. So as you listen to this third movement, you'll notice that in the first section, we have this parody march coming out of Frère Jacques. Sorry. There's that Frère Jacques melody in the double bass. Very slow, made minor. It's very mournful. You've got a monotonous drum, keeping an ostinato. And here comes in a round. Just like we talked about back when we were doing Row, Row, Row Your Boat in a canon, dividing our classroom up into 3. So we've got a round or a canon, that polyphonic imitation going on with Frère Jacques as the different instruments come on and enter the tune. If you follow along with your chart on 295, you'll hear where it goes into the second section where it becomes a little bit more dance-like. This is getting you ready for that trio section. But notice that the harmonies are still rather vulgar, rather distorted, lots of dissonance. There's still a tinge of a funeral march going on there. There's a little bit of a tempo uptick. You see some pizzicato, which remember are those strings plucking. There's a little bit more of a dance feeling to it, and there's a long cadence that takes you into section 3, which is the trio part. With that trio, we've got triplets in the accompaniment. It oscillates between major and minor. The melody is new. As I said, it's a folk song that has words about being a lost love. The rhythm's halted by drums. We eventually come into the fourth section, which has a lot of counterpoint and chaos going on. So two very different reactions to nationalism, exoticism, realism. In looking back or keeping the nostalgia, the romanticism, but Brahms keeping it very classical, very structured, Mahler expanding it or ballooning it even into more distortion of expressiveness. So that's the end of our look at the Romantic era. That is the end of this unit. So the next thing that you will want to make note of is that you have exam 3 on April 30th. There is a quiz for today, so please make sure that you go online today and take the quiz that is with this chapter, week 12, day 1. That quiz is open from 8 a.m. till 11:59. And then you'll want to make sure on April 30th, again from 8 a.m. to 11:59, exam 3 will be available for you. There will not be any listening questions. I will have a study guide on Canvas for you posted shortly after you're done with exam 2 so that you can start preparing for it. Let me know if you have any questions as you prepare for that exam 3. Thank you.